Presentation of dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up next, as we learn more about our founding fathers, sometimes that information can be controversial. I talk with Pulitzer Prize winning author Annette Gordon-Reed about the relationship President Thomas Jefferson had with one of his slaves and the rest of her family. That's next on Dialogue. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. History books can sometimes make our founding fathers seem more like statues than real people. Their lives, above reproach, appear unchanging, as if chiseled out of stone. The last few decades, though, have produced a remarkable body of research that provides more dimension for our most famous historical figures. With that, however, have come some revelations. In the case of Thomas Jefferson, those studies show that he most likely had as many as 7 children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. My guest today, Annette Gordon-Reed, has been interested in Jefferson since she was a little girl. As she grew older and became a historian, she grew frustrated that her colleagues so easily dismissed accounts of Jefferson's relationship with Hemings. In 1997, Gordon-Reed, a professor at the New York Law School and Rutgers University, wrote Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. The book examined how racism had clouded the ability of scholars to take seriously the account by Hemings' own son about his mother's relationship with Jefferson. Gordon-Reed had planned to then write a book about Jefferson himself, but she was drawn once again to the Hemings family and spent the next 9 years working on a book about the larger bonds between the Jeffersons and the Hemingses. It was a labor of love that paid off when the book, The Hemingses of Monticello, An American Family, went on to win both a National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. I had the opportunity to speak with Miss Gordon-Reed at the Sun Valley Writers Conference. Since 1995, the conference has been bringing together distinguished authors to discuss not only literature, but also issues of the day. I began by asking Miss Gordon-Reed why she wanted to learn more about Sally Hemings' family.
Well, I thought it was just a great opportunity after having come off writing about Sally Hemings, and I knew so many people were interested in her. It occurred to me that she really didn't make sense by herself, that she should be seen in the context of a bigger group of people. She was as someone's daughter and mother, sister, friend, and so forth. And since I know so many people wanted to know something about her, I thought I could sort of flesh her out a bit by writing about her. But then it was also that the family itself had other interesting individuals that I wanted people to know about.
Well, it worked out.
Yes, it
between
did.
the National Book Award and the Pulitzer.
Yes.
It definitely worked out. And fortuitous timing as well because of what's going on in our country.
Yes.
The first African-American president.
Well, people ask me sometimes, did you plan it that way? And my editor would sort of howl if he heard that, because this book is way overdue, and kept telling me, Annette, get me the book, get me the book, get me the book. But no, it worked out very, very well, because people are thinking about race and America and the founding of America, and it was such a perfect time, I think.
I think a lot of us who love history think about these meetings of the minds, you know, maybe a dinner party where you could get together all different types of people from different eras, and wouldn't it be great to have a party with Jefferson and Obama at the same table?
That would be interesting. It would be interesting to know what he felt about that.
What do you think?
Well, you know, I've actually had to write a piece about this, and it's difficult to know if the Jefferson who lived at that time, if he could sort of be brought forward through all of history and see all the changes and so forth, would have one idea about it. The Jefferson at the time would be stunned, obviously. Might not be surprised that Barack Obama's mother was white, and that might be, I mean, he might rationalize it in that particular kind of way. I think he might have been more surprised by Hillary as a possible candidate, because I think the woman thing would have been more difficult for him, I have a feeling, than the racial thing.
Well, you mentioned he wouldn't have been surprised that Obama's mother was white, and I think one of the most interesting parts of your book is that you really take the reader through our history, our American history, and show them that it was ubiquitous, it was commonplace for these blended families. to take place. In fact, it would have been unusual had it not happened because of the proximity. We're almost more segregated now.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Whites and blacks today live much more separate lives, physically separate lives, than blacks and whites did during the time of slavery. Now, when you say people are living together, we're not talking, this is not kumbaya harmony. There's slavery here, but in terms of proximity, day-to-day living sorts of things, people were all together in the same place. Certainly in the old days when people had servants, live-in servants, if you could imagine, 6 or 7 people who are in the house all the time, and they're a different race, and people know each other from the time they're babies and so forth. So it's not this isn't an idol that I'm describing here, but certainly male-female relationships were bound to happen. Rape was bound to happen. Actual relationships were bound to happen. So all of those things happened during that time period.
The subtitle of your book is An American Family, and that was obviously intentional.
Yes.
To describe that the Hemmings were as American as the Jeffersons.
Absolutely, any family, and this is something that I start with the story of Elizabeth Hemings, who's born in 1735. At the beginning, before America obviously is America at that point, the United States, before the United States exists, and most African Americans are descended from people who were brought to this country in the 1700s. And so, you know, it's funny when you hear, I was at a baseball game one time, and one of the patrons stood up to yell at a batter, something like, "Go back to Africa." And this guy who appeared to have been an immigrant, and I was sort of looking and I thought, how ironic, this guy's family has probably been here since the 1730s, and this notion of go back to Africa. But black Americans African Americans are Americans.
What some people may realize, but others may not, is that Jefferson's own wife, Martha, was actually a half-sister to Sally Hemings.
Yes.
Her father had children with one of his slaves, Elizabeth, and yet she brought these women to the house with her when she married Jefferson. You'd almost think that she wouldn't want any vestige or any reminder of what her father had done, that she had a half-sister who was a slave.
Yes, yes. Well, John Wales had buried 3 wives. John Wales, the father of Martha Wales and of Sally Hemings, had buried 3 wives and decided, I guess, that he didn't want to get married again. And so he took Elizabeth Hemings as a concubine, and they had 6 kids. Yes, but there were differing responses. You're right. I mean, there were some plantation mistresses, white women, who reacted badly to that kind of thing and would, you know, once their father died, would sell the children, or in some instances, if the father had granted freedom to the children, they would contest that in the will. But Martha evidently, had a different view about this kind of thing. So it gives a sense that there wasn't any rancor or any hostility towards her half-siblings. So there were 6 of them, 3 girls and 3 boys, and she brought them there, and they were sort of installed as the favorite house servants at Monticello. It's unimaginable for us, but that's what she did.
And about, what was it, maybe 6 years after her death, Martha's death, most historians now believe that Jefferson began the relationship with Sally Hemings.
Yes, when they were in Paris and before she came back. And so this would be 1789, 1790. And so it's this sort of generational thing continues.
You have said that the woman with whom Jefferson spent the largest number of years simply could not be written about at all. There's precious little information on Sally Hemings. First of all, that's daunting.
Yes.
But do you think that that was because no one wrote about her? Or do you think that what was written about this relationship was destroyed by the Jefferson family?
I would say, and I address this in the book, my guess would be that she was not written about. That they would not create the kinds of a paper trail about things. The interesting thing about it is that when they come back, Jefferson and his daughters and Sally Hemings and her brother come back from France, 1789, really 1790, December 25th, they're back at Monticello. And she sort of disappears from all writing at this point. They write about her sister, they write about her brothers, all these other people, and she had been at the center of their sort of nuclear family life. She had been, from the time she was small, the companion to Jefferson's daughters. And once this relationship starts, they get back to America, and she just sort of disappears. And so I think out of reticence, people would not put these kinds of things down, or even to write about her just casually. Certainly not about the relationship, but she disappears pretty much from everything. And yet there are, references to her sisters and to her brothers and so forth, which is sort of, it seems odd, but not so odd given who she was. Maybe what her position was.
Right, the lack of information shows maybe how important she really was.
Exactly, and then when people did memoirs of Monticello, they always mentioned her. So there's this odd sense in the Jefferson family, if you looked at the letters, you would say, she has no importance because she's not there. But then when people are recollecting Monticello, she always comes up.
Before we continue, do the majority of historians now agree that Jefferson had 7 children with Sally Hemings, 3 of which, of whom died?
Mm-hmm.
Is that pretty well?
Well, I haven't done a poll of them, but
right.
I do know that the majority of, certainly when I get manuscripts, articles, so forth, all those kinds of things about this is sort of written of as if it's true. I think the tide has turned on that. And I'm sure that there are probably people who will never believe it. It doesn't, it's never going to satisfy everybody, but the consensus is that this story is true.
Right.
And that's the way they treated it at Monticello as well now.
Fawn Brodie, when she first wrote about this, that it was not.
Oh, not at all.
Taken
no,
well.
at all.
What do you think changed the opinion? Can you point to something that changed the opinion to where people started to believe, yes, this is true. Jefferson, one of our quote, quote, heroes, did have children with Sally Hemings?
Well, I think I'd like to think that one of the things that happened, first I would say the sort of preparation for my first book was that many people in the historical community began to have a different look at the founding fathers. There became a less sort of worshipful attitude. There was I think it's a generational thing. Older scholars had written about Jefferson almost and Washington and all these people in totally reverential terms. They're almost like monuments in a way, not really human beings. That started to change in the 70s and in the 80s. And even though people weren't willing to accept the Hemings story at that point, just the fact that you could sort of pivot off of this notion of Jefferson as this, monument was something that laid the groundwork for it. When my book came out, I think by the time my first book came out, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy, that came out, people were ready to hear what it was that I said. They were prepared for that, to say, look, the evidence for this has been overlooked and sort of underplayed, and the people that you're relying on, I could easily show how they weren't telling the truth. And once I did that, and then when the DNA corroborated what it was that I said.
Explain that a little bit.
The DNA is not a strict paternity test, but what they decided to do was to look at the Y chromosome of Jefferson men, Hemings men, and Carr's. Now, the Carr's were looked at because Jefferson's family had always said, well, the reason these children look like Jefferson, because everybody said they looked exactly like Jefferson, was that they were the children of his sister's son, a Carr. So they looked at Carr DNA, Hemings DNA, and Jefferson DNA, and the Carr story was totally obliterated because the Carr was obviously, they're in a different family, and the Jefferson and the Hemings family, they had the same Y chromosome. Now that doesn't prove, that's not a strict paternity test. That doesn't prove that Jefferson was the father of this child. But there's never any one thing that usually proves anything. It's a complement of things. So you take the DNA, you take the fact that the family lied. I mean, why would the family say, people who knew that it was the Carrs, unless they were trying to protect someone? Then you take the other evidence about Jefferson's proximity to Hemings. He's present for every one of her conceptions of children. The names of the children, they're all named for people who are associated with him. His neighbors talked about this in their private diaries and other things. So it's a complement of all the information. And so with that, the tide really turned.
It's interesting. Some people just still don't want to believe, do they?
No. And I understand that because it requires you to, Jefferson is a figure that means a lot to people. Everybody has their Jefferson, right? And if you come to people and give them a bit of information that changes what they think about their Jefferson, they're going to be resistant to it. I mean, if someone came and told me something that I had not thought about about Jefferson, there might be a moment where I would say, hey, wait a minute. I don't think that I would do it in the face of a lot of evidence.
And does the Hemings family in present time acknowledge the story, feel proud that they are related to the Jeffersons?
You know, they have always treated this as just a part, just like you would know your grandpa. I mean, they haven't really made a big deal about it. It's more people on the outside who've made a big deal about it. But they have always accepted this as something that's a part of who they are, and they have not made a big deal about it.
And is the Jefferson line through Martha accepting of it now?
Not all of them. The majority of them, they have an association, and the majority of members of that association, the Monticello Association, say no. They're not our relatives and we will not accept them. There's a good group of people who say, oh, come on, we know this is true, you know, face it. But I have no idea what's going to happen with that.
And Monticello itself, the site,
the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which is separate from the Family Association, accepts this. And so that's, you know, they have come to grips with this and have their own way of dealing with it now in their visitor center and the exhibits that they have there.
While the tide may have turned in terms of people accepting that he fathered these children, there's still a lot of uncomfortable feelings about her age.
Yes, yes.
And she was 16
she was
probably,
16,
and he was in his 40s, is that correct?
He was 30 years older than her, so he would have been 46.
Right. But, you know, and we don't have a lot of time, unfortunately. I'd love to spend a longer amount of time going through the book, but in your book you explicate that and you really talk about how it was a different era.
Yes.
There were huge age differences between mates.
Yes, and, you know, the age of consent in Virginia was 10. You know, people gasp when you say that, but that's the way people thought about male-female relations. Not that people went around having sex with 10-year-olds all the time, but they thought that somebody 10 years old could, in fact, consent to sex.
There was also some, I think it was it the New York Times critic on your book who said that in his feeling was that by definition, Sally Hemings would have had to have been raped to have these children. And your book really looks at that argument and talks about the fact that she was an individual, she was making some choices, and perhaps there was a real relationship going on.
And she was in a place where she was not under Virginia law. They were in France when this started. And what I wanted to try to do there was to talk about to sort of show what the Hemings family, their presentation of this story, meant to them. That this was not a story of, you know, this was a story of a triumph, in a victory for their mother, who got their freedom for them, who made a choice about
because
her
Sally
life.
Hemings, when she was in France, told Jefferson she'd only come back
exactly
if he freed
if
her
he
children.
freed her children. Because if she'd come back to Virginia and had any children, because of the rules of following that slavery followed the mother, all of her children would be enslaved.
Do you understand, though, why people feel that it must be rape because she was a slave and she was a teenager?
Exactly.
And perhaps it was rape to begin with, and then it morphed into something else. But you understand how people feel.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah? And that was one of the more difficult parts of the book to struggle with, to think about, well, what does this mean? Here's this young woman who is in France, who's on free soil, who decides to come back with him. But he's also a person whom she has known back in Virginia as a master. He has control over her and her brother when they're back in Virginia. So it's very, very complicated. But on the other hand, I do know that this was his wife's half-sister. The quality of his dealings with her siblings, I think, can be a surrogate for how he felt about her in a way. I mean, there's a tendency to, when I talk about it in the book, to make every black person's life based upon a sort of generalized view of black people's life. So if you can go outside the Hemings family and look at the enslaved community and say, well, other black women were raped in that time period, it would seem to me that you could look at the family, the things that are going on in their particular lives, to say, wait a minute, there's a whole complement of people here. How would they respond to him if they thought
in other words, her brother,
if
he thought she was being raped, might have
They said, we're going to stay here. We're going to stay here instead of going back. These are people who treat him almost like he's an in-law more than like somebody. I mean, they buy him gifts. They seem to grow closer to him after this is over. So the way I try to write it is to say that, you know, this is a complicated situation, and I don't think a historian can say that all situations are, in every situation that has existed at the time, anytime a black man and a white woman, or excuse me, a white man and a black woman had sex during slavery, that it was rape. They never wanted to sleep with each other, or they never cared for each other. That all of everybody doesn't always do anything. And so I think that's what history is about, really, about contingency.
What I thought was so fascinating was you point out that actually this was in the tabloids at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, we like to think, oh, it's been discovered recently, but, you know, people used it against Jefferson to try to not get him elected.
Yeah.
And the general population didn't seem to...
Didn't care.
Didn't deter them from electing him.
Yeah, I mean, that's an amazing thing about the American people. There are scandals, sex scandals that come up periodically, and people don't seem to be interested in that. I mean, James Callender wrote about this in 1802, hoping that he was going to forestall Jefferson's reelection. Jefferson buys Louisiana. He is resoundingly reelected. People don't care about who he's sleeping with. They cared about the fact. They cared about his policies, really. So it didn't really work.
And during all this scrutiny, Jefferson had yet another child with her.
Yes.
So you would think if he was worried about it, he would
lay off of this and go away and do. But I mean, it was something that was seen as private, and people just did not like the idea of dragging that out and using that sort of as a club.
This issue, though, still has traction today politically when you look at the rumors that were spread about John McCain in the South. And so it is not behind us.
No, it's not.
And I'm curious to know what you thought about, this is a little bit of a diversion, but about, I'm thinking about it now, about Strom Thurmond.
Well, when you raised that, I thought the same thing. What irony. I mean, for people to try to say that, you know, John McCain, don't vote for him because he has a black daughter. Of course she's Bangladeshi, but, you know, as if he'd had some liaison with a black woman. And Strom Thurmond, who they all knew that. I don't think I ever met anybody from South Carolina who didn't say to me, did you know that Strom Thurmond has a black daughter? Well before Essie Mae Washington Williams came out. So it's such hypocrisy, especially in that state, when they know what kind of mixing and things went on among prominent men who were greatly respected, men who were elected to the highest office there. So I always thought that was just, it would be funny if it were not so sad.
You mentioned that one of the ways that you pieced together how Jefferson might have felt about Sally Hemings was by looking at how he treated other members of her family. And the book is not just about Sally Hemings.
It's not,
you know,
it's not.
That's of course what people grab onto, but we learn a lot about her brothers, and it's so interesting that when he brought them to France, that he paid them wages.
Yes.
And even trained her brother to be a chef. And he could have gone on to be the first African-American chef in the White House had he chosen that. I mean, this was an extraordinary relationship between these families.
Yes, absolutely. And extraordinary not just because of how they treated one another, but the fact that there was this connection. How do you, and that's one of the things that I wanted to do in the book that wasn't done before, not to just describe James and Robert as his servants, but to remind people that these are his wife's half-brothers. And a lot of the stuff that is happening there is surely influenced by that as well.
And all of those children were eventually either quietly freed or formally freed, and several passed as white. The
two eldest left Monticello as white people without freedom papers, because if you have freedom papers, obviously you're not white. The two youngest were emancipated in his will. They took their mother and they moved into Charlottesville and stayed there with her until she died, and then they moved to Ohio.
A lot of people have been saddened by the fact that Jefferson didn't formally free Sally Hemings, the mother of his children. But you say really that's unrealistic to think that way, that he would even do that. And essentially she was free by proxy in a way. Because
yes, what they had was called giving people's time, because you had to have a formal declaration. He would have had to ask the legislature to free her, and then he would have had to ask the legislature for permission to let her stay in Virginia, because a slave couldn't stay there for more than a year without special permission from the legislature. And I cannot see him putting the names. Everybody who knew who Sally was. I mean, there were songs about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, ballads, all kinds of things. And I think he would have thought that that would have been a humiliation to his daughter. That's not satisfactory to us, but I think that's how he thought. And she does end up, you know, living away from Monticello from 1826 until her death.
What do you wish you had? What is there like a what if piece that you wish you really had?
Well, I wish I knew what she thought she was going to do in Paris. If that would be a question that I would ask
Why
Sally
she
Hemings.
came home.
Why she came
When
home.
she could have been free.
When she could have been free. Why she came home, and what did you think you were going to do there?
You have been interested in Jefferson since you were a very little girl.
Mm-hmm.
And did this change your view of him? I know you've said you really still believe that he is one of the greatest Americans that has lived.
He is. He's a person that we all have to grapple with. I mean, a lot of times people ask me, do you like him? Do you dislike him or whatever? But I don't really think of it in that way. It's just that he is a person who you have to deal with on every single subject about the development of America. He is at some point, you know, part of it.
Should this story, the story of Sally Hemings, for instance, be taught in elementary school? And
Well, I think it probably is. My daughter came home with a magazine called Footsteps when she was in the 4th grade, and it was a special issue about Monticello and so forth, and they talk about Sally Hemings there in age-appropriate ways. And so, yes, I do think I think the Hemingses should be a part of American history, not just Jefferson. Monticello was theirs as well, and that was the point of the book.
And what's next for you?
Well, I'm going to finish up a 2nd volume about the Hemings family, taking them through the 19th century, and then I'm going to start a biography of Jefferson.
And I know you've been asked, there have been so many biographies of Jefferson, what do you want to bring to readers that's different or new?
Much more about Jefferson as a plantation owner, life at Monticello. There's so much material that has not been covered. People mainly wrote about Jefferson as a political figure, which I intend to do as well, but to do a biography of the man himself and the man at home and the people and the neighbors, Charlottesville, to give people a better sense of the world that he came from.
And finally, what did you learn about yourself doing this?
That I have tunnel vision, that I've learned that, you know, and to my great surprise, that I have great powers of concentration that I didn't think I had. And to actually go through this and slog through this for 9 years, even though I loved it, I loved every moment of it, but I learned how much of a library rat I really am.
Well, thank you. The product of this research is a wonderful book that I've read and I encourage other people to read. And thanks for taking the time to be with me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is wonderful.
You've been listening to a conversation with Annette Gordon-Reed, who won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize for her book, The Hemingses of Monticello. I'd like to thank the organizers of the conference for allowing us to interview some of their speakers. For more information on the event and to hear interviews with the other authors I've met, check out the Dialogue website at idahoptv.org. And thanks for tuning in to this edition of Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.